Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, programmers of all languages. I'd like to welcome you to my session on creating a magical user experience. First, a little bit about who I am. My name is Dan O'Farron. I'm a software developer by trade. I have had a kind of a passing interest in magic my whole life. You can see right here, I'm actually doing magic tricks at my nephew's birthday party, and that's my son there poking his head out, doing a little bit of cups and balls. I'm also an open source contributor. I've contributed code to the Groovy project. I'm a co-founder on a framework called the Griffin framework, which is a Swing and JavaFX desktop client suite. And I've also been interested in magic my whole life. However, I am not a magician. And we'll get into why I say that I am not a magician, even though I like to do magic tricks and even though I'm interested in this. Oh, forgot to plug my book. I wrote a couple chapters in Andres Almiri's Griffin in Action book, which unfortunately was not in the store. And I think it might be back in stock in Amazon. I don't know. They were running low on one point. But who do I work for? I work for a company called Intelligent Software Solutions. I actually write Swing code for a living all day, and I've been doing that for nearly 10 years now at various companies in the Colorado Springs area. Two of the products we have there, WebTaz is the product I work on, and the other one is called Sydney. If any of you have been, quote-unquote, in theater in Afghanistan or Iraq, there's a chance you've heard of one of those two products. They're pretty big out there. We're actually headquartered in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We have offices in Denver, Hampton, D.C., Rome, New York, Boston, and Tampa. And just like every other company here, yes, we're hiring if you want to go to the job page and look at it. We are a defense contractor, so you need to be clearable, ultimately. So the question probably everyone here is thinking at some point is, why magic? Did I just want to get a free ticket to Java 1 by performing a few parlor tricks in front of a crowd? I mean, maybe I should have submitted a talk on method dispatch or maybe programming languages. I did. They turned them down. This was the talk they took. So, I tried my best. But as I researched this, it's actually surprising just how well some of the concepts that go into creating a good magic show and a good magic trick are the exact same concepts that you would put into making a good user experience for your application. Now, I use the word user experience. User experience is a word that's really come into vogue more so in the past 5 to 10 years because it extends to more than what the old word that we used to use, which was user interface, usually in the frame of graphical user interface. User experience extends more to just the experience between the human and the computer. It extends to how you conceptualize the way you work with your application, the way that it's delivered to you. I mean, it extends all the way to how MacBooks are shipped and how they're put in the box and you open it up and you can open it right up and you get a nice, beautiful screen helping you get in. So it's those little extra things beyond just the pixels on the screen that really help you get a better experience. But the letters UI were not always for user interface. When I was researching this, I learned that Alan Kay, back in the 1960s and 70s, when he was working on the Alto project in Palo Alto, he first coined the phrase as user illusion. At the time, computers, if you were lucky, you had a green screen. More likely, you had a teletype machine spitting out letters and numbers at you, and you gave them a stack of punch cards to make it work. So when you put a television screen in front of somebody and you tell them it's a computer, they don't believe you. And that actually kind of worked in his favor, because what he wanted the user to do with the computer to make it personal was they didn't want to think of it as a 1960s big box room full of computer. He wanted it to think that you were working on a desktop, working on a piece of paper. You were writing a letter. So he was talking about creating the illusion of a piece of paper on the screen using graphics, using borders and shadows and corners. And the pointer was the illusion of you interacting with that illusionary piece of paper. And like all desktops, you have more than one piece of paper on it. So that's where the overlapping windows come in. You move stuff around and you act on the desktop. So back in the 1960s, this was a big deal for people to work with computers like they would work on their desktop. It was really revolutionary. And when I think of the phrase user illusion, I thought, maybe I should have had another name for this talk. User illusion 1, lies. It's a little Guns N' Roses reference. So if I give this talk again next year at Java 1, I'm probably going to call it User Illusion 2, the SKEUOMORPH incident. Again, the spaghetti incident was another one of the Guns N' Roses albums. We'll get to skeuomorphism a bit later. But right now, let's talk a little bit about human behavior. You're probably familiar with the concept if you've taken psychology of Maslow's hierarchy. What this is this is layers of ways that people act. That built wrong. There we go. It's not showing here how it's building out there. That's kind of annoying. But it's showing 5 different layers of the way that people act in a given situation in most cases. Given a situation, if you are hungry and starving, you are going to take risks you ordinarily wouldn't take. But if you're full and you've had a good meal and a lion is chasing you, you're going to run away from that lion. Whereas if you're hungry, you're going to try and kill the lion and eat it. And it goes up to socialization. You know, once you're safe, you're gonna seek out friends, and then self-esteem. You're gonna seek out friends that you like and that like you. You know, it's some people it's more important to have friends than have friends that like you. And once you have friends that like you, you're going to go up to the final level of Maslow's hierarchy, the very peak of the pyramid, and that is to try and be the best person that you think you can be. Once you've fulfilled all those 4 base needs, you can fulfill that. So let's do a little magic trick first. I have to apologize, I don't have a lapel mic. But you know, magic has been around almost as long as we've existed as we need. But magic, as we know it today, has existed for roughly 2,000 years. And the very first trick was a trick called the cups and the balls. So we have a ball and we have a cup. And there's my magic wand. So it's really simple. You take the ball, and this was done by old charlatans at the time. They do 3-card money. I'm just going to do 1 ball and 1 cup. You know, you take the ball, you put it in various places, and I'm going to reach in my pocket and get some hotspot optimizations. And with these hotspot optimizations, you know, think of that ball as a problem. It's gone. Except it's not really gone. All we've done is we've just hidden the problem somewhere else. So that's kind of the cups and balls. But here's my magic wand that's falling apart. You know, like all magic tricks, it works on a hierarchy. You know, if you do a trick wrong, you know, I'm kind of ruining it here. If it's done properly, you know, you see this magic wand, and then you see me waving scarves. And if I do it poorly, it just kind of falls apart and looks kind of silly. So your applications, similarly, to become magic, need to work on a similar 5-step hierarchy. Now, to begin with, your application must be functional. It must do something. Applications that do nothing don't go very far. I mean, at least those noise apps on your iPhone do something. You know, they ring a cowbell or whatever noises they want to make. The next step is that your application must be reliable. It must be willing. It must do the things that you expect it to do every time you try and do it. Then it has to be usable. I mean, if it reliably makes a noise, it's going to sit in your pocket unless you happen to have the right time to play that noise. Application that keeps you updated with your social network is going to get far more use than that. Finally, it needs to be efficient. I mean, imagine if you have a Excel table and you had to delete each one of your 500 rows manually. That would get tedious. But if you could select all 500 of your rows at once and then delete them with one step, that makes a better application. But finally, once we have all 4 of these levels filled, finally, your application can work on becoming a truly magical application. Just like a magic trick, if you don't have the basics down, if you don't have the things prepared that you need for your application to work, who cares what cool visual graphics you have going on in it and what special effects you have going on? If it crashes all the time, nobody cares. It's got to be efficient, it's got to be usable, reliable, and functional. It's got to be stable before you can go to the top of that hierarchy. Now, success is fleeting. Here I have what I consider to be 2 of the most important applications in the past 20 years. And, you know, the progenitors that made these things most famous. The first one from the 20th century is the internet browser. And that is, of course, I believe it's the second version of Netscape. I found a picture for version 2.0. We don't use Netscape today. You know, it was a big major game changer, and it was magical, and it was awesome, but we don't have it today. And similarly with iTunes. iTunes probably is, since the internet browser, the most important application to change the way that we interact with the world. If you look at Apple stock rise, it didn't start going straight up until the day that they released the iTunes Music Store. They released the iPod. People yawned. They released the iPod for Windows. People yawned. They gave you the iTunes Music Store. Up, up, up. So what this is, it reliably gets music on your iPod or iPhone from people selling it, and getting all those record companies to agree to one standard was truly a magical trick. However, failure is forever. If there's one thing that the version 6 of the iOS operating system is going to be remembered for, it's how bad the maps are. Even when they fix it, even when they get it right, it's going to have a bad reputation. That's why people stopped using Netscape. They released Netscape version 4 way too early. It was full of bugs. It wasn't reliable. It blew up on a regular basis. And people said, you know what, I'm going to start using Internet Explorer. It wasn't so much that Microsoft beat Netscape in that case, more that Netscape pulled defeat from the jaws of victory in that situation. Now, whenever you see people do magic tricks, invariably they're going to ask, well, how do you do the trick? And the magician is always going to not tell the trick. Because there's 3 well-established rules of magic that they're probably going to tell you when they do their magic trick. The first rule is never reveal the secret of the trick to the audience. If you know the secret, it's not magic anymore. It's just sleight of hand. It's just juggling. It's acrobatics. It's not magic anymore. The second rule is to never do the same trick twice for the same audience. And the reason is you want to keep them wondering. Like Jerry Seinfeld said, he feels that moment where he gets off the stage where they still want more, and if he does more, it would provide actually less. That's the moment. You want to keep them wanting more. So that's why you never do the same trick twice. Because, people think the reason you do the same trick twice is people might figure out the trick, but then you're filling their needs. It's not that they're going to figure out, it's that you give too much of it. And the third rule is to never let the audience see your secret preparations. If they see that the bunny is not in your hat, but he's hanging, on a bag on the side of the table, they're going to see the trick coming. Tricks are most effective when you don't see it coming. When you're surprised and astonished by it, when you don't expect it, that's when it's best. Now, there's more than rules that magicians work by than just the rules of the show. There's rules that magicians operate by within magicians themselves. And back in the vaudeville times, before a magician would share his tricks with another person, they would usually make him swear an oath. And this is why I say I'm not a magician. I have never sworn any such oath. And the oath is basically that it says that as a magician, I promise never to reveal the secret of any illusion to a non-magician, unless that one in turn swears to uphold the magician's oath. I promise never to perform any illusion for a non-magician without first practicing the effect until I can perform it well enough to maintain the illusion of magic. And this is something the magicians would hold each other to. I mean, it started breaking down in the 70s and 80s and 90s with television and the internet, and just about any trick out there, you can look on the internet and figure out how they do it. Like Penn and Teller's magic bullet trick. No one's figured out all 9 secrets that Penn and Teller do, but they pretty much figured out the most of it. But even then, when you know the secret, it's a pretty good show to go watch. It's pretty entertaining. So even magicians, when they share with each other, they keep these rules to work with themselves. And they also form organizations. The Magician's Circle is a magic organization based mostly in the United Kingdom. And their oath, which is written in Latin, and I don't quite know what the Latin for that is, how to pronounce it, but I did know that the English translation, a rough translation, says that they are not apt to reveal secrets. So you're going to get in this fraternal order, and you're going to share your tricks with everyone on the premise that your tricks are safe with everyone in the room that knows your magic tricks. It's a big old thing of trust. The reason why it's important to keep some of these magic tricks secret is a little literary concept called the suspension of disbelief. And this was coined by a man named Samuel Taylor Coleridge. If anybody's seriously studied English literature, I'm sure you've heard of him. I had to go to Wikipedia to figure this out. And in the part where he was quoted for bringing up the phrase suspension of disbelief, it was coupled with another term that I found really relevant to magic and to your applications, probably more to your applications than a magic show. Now, the suspension of disbelief only really works when there is human interest and a semblance of truth. For example, let's take this story of a young farm boy who doesn't like his life on the farm. And he finds an old knight who in turn teaches him the secrets of the knighthood. And then he learns that there is this princess that is hidden up in this dark knight's stronghold. So he goes, he invades the stronghold, rescues the princess, and then destroys the stronghold. And that sounds like a very compelling semblance of truth. That sounds like something that could happen. But when I tell you that this whole story happens in space, it takes an entirely different turn. I've just described the plot for Star Wars. So you get these human interests, and without the young farm boy who doesn't want to become a moisture farmer and be stuck on Tatooine his whole life, the number of people who want to watch, laser battles and starships blowing each other up, I mean, there's still people that want to see that, but it's significantly less. You get a good story in, and you cater to the whole audience. So let's talk for a minute about these two characters. On the left, this is the sort of person you might find in a back alley around here in San Francisco with his cardboard box. And he's got a deal for you. If you can tell him which one of these 3 cards holds a queen, he'll double your money. I mean, let's do the math. 2/3 odds, 2-to-1 payback? Yes. And then there's the man on the left, and what he says is, hey, give me $50 up front, and I'll make things disappear. Now, the man on the left is your typical con artist. And what he's using is he's going to use the same techniques of magic to do his trick. I mean, it seems like a good odds, 2/3 odds for a 2-to-1 payback. You're going to lose all your money. There are so many magical tricks that they use between crowd plants and sleight of hands and card flipping and sometimes just plain old dumb luck that you're going to lose all your money and you're going to be upset about it. But when you start following people like this other man, and this man is called David Copperfield. This is a picture from 1970s before he became really famous. If you start, paying your $50 up front to see him, you're going to be spending $50 again to see him, and again and again and again. The difference is this time, you're going to feel good about it. What separates these two characters? What's the difference? They're using the same tricks. They're doing the same things. One's dressed a little better. Expectations? Actually, close. Ethics. You have the expectation that these guys are going to perform in an ethical manner. The card shark on the street, you expect him to rob you blind, or you're going to be robbed blind, one or the other. And the magician, you expect to walk into there and he's going to lie to you. He's going to tell you these outrageous lies and these huge deceptions. And you're expecting that. And when he's not good at lying to you, you're actually kind of upset. What's different? Ethics. The difference is, when you go to see David Copperfield perform, he takes care of things that are important to be ethical, and the card shark's there just to try and take your money. I've identified 4 things that I think that most magicians really need to take care of. The first one is safety. The second one is integrity, and then respect and proactivity. Now, the safety of the magician, he needs to be concerned about the safety of both the performers and of the audience. If there's a wild tiger on stage and he asks for an audience volunteer to come up on stage, he has the ethical obligation to keep you safe. Similarly, if he's his magician assistant, he's going to put the magician's assistant in a cage with a tiger. He needs to make sure that the tiger is not going to eat the magician's assistant. The second one is integrity. These magicians need to keep secrets. We've already talked about the societies that they belong to and the oaths that they used to give to each other to keep these magic tricks secrets. They expect the secrets to be kept. And then there's respect. When a magician sees another magician perform and he figures out his trick, there's a certain amount of respect where you don't just take the trick and you do the exact same trick the exact same way. I mean, you might learn some pointers. You might learn a new technique or two. But when you take another magician's trick, you are under obligation to make it your own. You don't just, copy, you steal, and you make it your own, kind of like what Apple does. And finally, proactivity. Steve Jobs' own words. Finally, there's the issue of proactivity. If you go to a real modern ethical magic, not some person who's going to try and convince you that they have paranormal powers, but a real magician, he's going to do things that are going to make you think he has paranormal powers. But at least once during the show, either at the beginning, the end, or maybe even multiple times, he's going to tell you that everything that goes on in the show is an illusion. He's going to tell you that he's going to lie to you, that this is a fraud, and then he's going to do it, and he's going to pretend like it's real. And you understand it's a stage show. You can suspend your disbelief. You don't have the expectation that he can actually levitate cards out of his hand for real. It looks like it. It has the effect of it, but he's going to tell you it's an illusion. So how do these apply to your application? First bit with safety. Whenever your users trust data to you, you need to respect that trust and honor that trust. It's a sacred trust. Their identity, their information. I mean, sometimes they're going to give you your bank card information. You need to protect that. When you're going to create when you create this magical experience, people are going to want to use your applications and use your stuff. You need to be ethical and respect it. You need to keep the secrets that they give you, just like a magician keeps their magic secrets. If you're using a proprietary API, you need to respect the developers that have given you that API and the rules that they have for interacting with it. If you're using open source software, you need to respect that license. Integrity, keep secrets, and proactivity. If something goes wrong in your application, if there's a data breach, you have an obligation to tell them. If there's a chance that they might lose your data, if you're a backup service, you need to outline it. These are called service level agreements. You need to tell them what they can expect from you up front, ahead of time, So that when the data center goes down because there's a giant windstorm on the East Coast, you can say, well, we told you, we did our best, but we told you. So the important thing when writing your applications is don't be unethical. And this is probably an example, one of my favorite examples of unethical uses of magical techniques on the internet. Are you focusing on the ad or are you focusing on the content? I mean, the placement is one thing, but that's just part of the game. But to have the motion and the fluttering and the face and all the interaction with it, that's just not right. That's unethical. They're using the very same techniques that you might use to tell the user an alert that, hey, it's time to go to your meeting. So let's go back to the rules of magic. Discuss these for a little bit. What is the one unifying thing in all of these three rules? Never, never, never. Okay, that's a good one. I never thought of that. Never, never, never. And that rule is broken often. Many times they do that. Have you ever seen Penn and Teller do their cups and balls with clear plastic cups? That, by the way, is the fourth rule of magic. Never, ever do the cups and balls with clear plastic cups. And it's an amazing technique if you want to go see it. And it works, is what I think is amazing. What's common with these is the audience. All of these rules talk about the magician's interaction with the audience. The audience is what's important. Without an audience, there is no magic to be had. There is no performance. You're just practicing. Without a performer and an audience to perceive the performance, there's only one world. So you got to realize when you're building your application that you need to consider your audience. You need to think about your audience and think of what they're doing. Now, there's many ways to separate your audience members up. There's entire conference sessions about how to adapt to your users. But when I think of this in a magical sense, I split it into three groups. And I've got male names for these groups and female names on the right because it's important. You know, PC gets a bad rap and sometimes, but I think there are some cases where it's been proven that if you always use men's names, people are going to think, oh, astronauts are all men. So in this case, I'm using men's name and women's name. So we got, for the women, we have Helen, the rock band Heart and Hermione. Those are three groups. And then the guys' equivalents would be Mike, Metallica, and Merlin. What we have here is just your random normal user, your entry-level user. And then you have the rock stars. They know what they're doing. They're awesome at what they do. But boy, if they find a brown M&M in that bowl in the backstage, they are going to trash the place. True story. Happened about an hour south of me. And finally, you have the geniuses, the people who actually know everything. So we could think of this in Harry Potter terms as the muggles, who don't know there's a magical world, the squib, who knows there's a magical world but aren't magical, and of course the wizards and the witches, who know about the magical world and are magical. Roughly speaking, people who don't know the trick. People who know the trick, and this is the most important distinguishment, people who can actually do the trick. Because I know how a lot of magicians do a lot of their tricks, and I'm in awe because there is no way I could possibly ever pull some of those tricks off. So it's kind of cool. So how might you leverage these three kinds of audience in, say, programming environment? So we have here first is Alice. This is a program that has been promoted in several Java 1s. This is a programming environment to teach mostly kids how to learn how to program, but pretty much people who have no exposure to programming before. You got this little rover up here that you're animating in this case, but you make scenes where people do stuff, and instead of thinking it as abstract concepts, you have people in scenes doing things. You have nice large user interface items here. There's not a single curly brace in sight. So people can learn the concepts of programming in this integrated development environment. Now the rock stars, they might use something like IntelliJ or NetBeans. I personally use IntelliJ because everyone else in my office uses IntelliJ. I would use NetBeans if everyone else did. But in this case, you have a lot more power to do a lot of the different things that you could do here. In this case, I've got a distributed version control system open up, and I'm looking at commits. I have the code. I have the file layout. I have a bajillion things that I could do in the toolbar. Let's see. There's open, save, undo, redo, cut, paste. I've probably used all of those at some point, although not frequently. So this gives me all the power that I need. But the real wizards kind of ruined it, but they use VI. They don't need fancy code completions. They know what they're doing. In fact, the real wizards could probably just hack out the bytecode by themselves if they really needed to. So those are the three ways that you might leverage you might leverage a trick. Yeah, okay. So this is probably the American version of what would be the magic circle. This is a place called the Magic Castle. It's down in Los Angeles. And this is the theater that all real serious professional magicians aspire to be admitted to and to perform in. It's a big deal to get there. It's a big deal to be admitted there. You only get there if you are a magician or if you're coming with a magician who has been admitted to the Magic Castle. So this is like the highest echelon. But what's interesting to note is in here, they don't have just one theater. They have 3 theaters. Because the type of tricks that you do is different based on the stage that you perform on. There are some tricks that you would attempt in one theater that you wouldn't attempt in another just because of the nature of the way it works. So leverage your stage when you do your application. So the 3 theaters that they have in the Magic Castle are the close-up gallery, basically the equivalent of what someone who is street busking might do. The second one is the parlor prestidigitation, more of a family room or living room type setting where you would get together and do magic tricks on a closer scale. There's a theater just a few blocks from here that I'm kind of bummed they didn't do shows on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I have a flight at 7, so I can't go see one of their shows. It's supposed to be a really good place. And the third stage that you perform on is the Palace of Mystery. These are the large stage effects. This is where you might, roll a locomotive on stage, get a really quiet and really fast hydraulic lift and make it disappear that way. And, the tricks you would do in a close-up gallery, you got to realize that people might be at all angles of you. So the tricks have to work 360 degrees around. When you're in the parlor prestidigitation, you have 720. You can block some stuff. And you can bring stuff with you. You can bring your suitcase of tricks and set up your own little platform. Most of the tricks that I'm doing today are of the parlor magic variety. And finally, you have the Palace of Mystery. People are sitting in an audience. They have a stage. They have one perspective on the trick. If you see these stage magic tricks from behind, you've ruined the trick and you know what's going on. But usually, if you're seeing the trick from the backside of the trick, you're a paid stagehand and you know what's going on. So I might ascribe these to 3 different platforms that we technically target. Web applications, of course, would be the close-up gallery because you've got to bring everything with you when you do a web application. You want to use Node.js? Guess what? You're downloading it and you bring it to the web page when you load it up. The second one is desktop application. You generally install these. If you need something, you install it and you have it there and prepared. You can bring some stuff, but you can't bring other stuff. And the third one, this is probably head scratcher to some of you people, an embedded device. It's actually the smallest of the 2 platforms, but why would I put it in the biggest stage? The reason I put the embedded device for the biggest stage is that in an embedded device, you control everything. You control the chips that are in there, you control the shape and the hardware of it, you control the tints of the screen, you control the angles that they look at, and you control absolutely everything in these. So again, web applications, when you run your web application, you pretty much have to bring everything with you and load it. Caching helps in this regard, but technically on your web page you're saying, bring this with me. Desktop applications, you will install the code. And embedded devices, it's all on the chips. So here's 3 different techniques of the video stages of how people do video. The first one is YouTube. That's technically seen on a web page. They use Flash. They use the codec that Flash has. They bring all of their graphical user interfaces with them every time, which is really nice when they want to change their design. It's just changed. They bring it with them. The second one would be VLC. This is a video codec program for Windows and Mac and Linux. And this program plays every video and audio codec out there. That's their point. That's their pride and joy. If you have a .aif file that you need to play, you play it on VLC. You don't even try with QuickTime and Windows Media Player. You don't try with all that codec mess. It has it. But the trick is, it's kind of a large program. It's got to bring every single codec for decoding it with you. And the third example is an old competitor for TiVo called the Replay TV. And an interesting piece of trivia for the TiVo, not the TiVo, the Replay TV, is when they bought knowing that they were buying some defective MPEG-2 chips. There were some defects in the encoding that it didn't fit the MPEG-2 standard, but it was reversible. You encoded it with this flaw, you decoded it with the flaw, and it looked fine. But you know what? It's a sealed box. You're not getting any video off of that unless you're doing it through a television set. So who cares about the MPEG-2 standard? We control all the chips, we control the reading and the writing, we don't need to interact with the other world. We control the stage. So they're leveraging the stage of their big stage there to control absolutely everything in their effect. So, who's in the mood for another magic trick? Don't have a lavalier mic, so I'm just going to have to do it kind of up here. But here we have, our typical deck of cards. So I need a volunteer from the audience to pick a card. Here. Card. All right. Now, I want you to show it to the audience. Lift it up. In case you can't see, that card is the 3 of clubs. It gets more impressive. Put the card, give me a number between 1 and 10. So, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, an interesting fact about this card, this is Penn and Teller's favorite card because it is easy to detect at a distance that there's 3 of them, and the clubs is the easiest shape to recognize. Now, this trick isn't all that special, when you stack the deck with nothing but the 3 of clubs. It's a technique called forcing a card. And stacking a deck is the easiest way. The really good magicians will use, they can use sleight of hand to actually make you pick a specific card out of it if they're really good at it. I'm not that good. I got to cheat. But I gave you the suggestion that you had a choice. And it's really interesting. We're like halfway through the talk, and we're finally talking about techniques of magic. So let me step back a little bit and tell you that the setup and the preparation for magic is easily half the time. You got to think through your application in setting up these magical effects. You really got to plan it through. Planning is half of execution. The plan's useless, but the process of planning is priceless in creating these magical effects. So let me get back to suggestion and the illusion of choice. So when I forced that card, you had the illusion that you had a choice. You thought you could pick any one of those 52 cards in the deck and it would work just fine. Kind of like Neo in The Architect in The Matrix. At some point you got to give them a choice whether or not they realize it. And in The Matrix, they actually had a legitimate choice to make. But your users sometimes don't know the choices that are presented to them. And the trick is, you got to think about it in Murphy's Law. If there's 2 or more ways to do something and one of them can always result in catastrophe, then someone will do it. Now that's probably not how you heard the law, but it's proving the law because there's many ways to state the law. You've probably heard it as if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Proving the law. It's not catastrophic, and there's 2 ways to do it, and someone's done it. So in creating your choices for the users, you really got to realize that if there is some choice that they can make, whether or not you're giving it to them, they will do it at some point. Even if it's the QA staff trying to find ways to break your application, it's better that they find it before one of your users find it. Now choice, when you give your choices illusion, one of the things that you can do to help this is you would limit the choices that a user could make. And then you need to prepare for every possible choice. Finally, you need to tailor your choices to the audience. Because some people, if you give them the wrong sets of choices, they're going to say, no, I don't want A or B, I want C, give me C. So you need to anticipate the things that they're going to want. And it's kind of a trick, when you prepare for your audience, when we go back to those 3 groups of audiences, the Joe user, the rock star, and the genius, you really can only effectively target 2 of those groups. If you try and target all 3, it's not going to go that well. It's best if you can just target 1, but if you target 2, you can kind of fake it. So here's an example of how you might effectively manage the choice for someone who really doesn't know what they're doing. This is Git for Windows. It looks like a smartphone app. It's got nice, colors. They're not scared by all these hash codes that are being thrown at them. We kind of hide that. But there's a couple of important things. You can't do a push request from Git for Windows yet. That's not something they expose. And you can't work with multiple remote repositories. Now, somebody who is new to version control probably has no clue of what those 2 things are and what I just said. And they're happy to have an application that they can create a version tree of directories, save stuff, commit stuff, and go back and get to it. To them, those few choices are magical. This is a revelation to some people that you can version your stuff and go back in time and get it. I mean, look what Apple did with Time Machine. It's basically an elaborate version control system. You delete your file, you plug your hard drive in, you come back with a nice star field and scroll back and go back in time or something, and you get your information. And the people who know a lot about, the file system say, oh, they're just, committing the caches and storing the log file and just rolling it back and rebuilding it. And they're not terribly impressed. But somebody who knows nothing about computers and had the experience of when you delete a file, it's all gone, this is impressive to them. Now, a SQUIB might use something like Git integration in their integrated development environment. It gives them more of their options. It gives them the options to use. In this case, I'm showing the multiple remotes that you can use inside of IntelliJ. Eclipse and NetBeans have the similar capabilities. You can do a lot more of the exotic operations like stashing your changes and unstashing them, of doing 8-way octopus merges with 7 different remotes. You can do all the crazy stuff in here. But a real wizard, if you wrote Git, you don't use these fancy tools. You use the command line. That's what Linus does. Actually, Linus goes into the files and edits them himself. But when you're a step below Linus, when you're one of his lieutenants, you use the command line tools that have been written. And you got to deal with ugly things like hash codes, SHA hash codes, and you got to really understand the difference between a blob and a directory is. And you got to know where you are in your file tree and all sorts of other things. But these people are geniuses. They wrote Git. This stuff doesn't scare them. When they look at this, they think, well, I could improve it this way, and they probably go in and do it directly in improvement. So the choice is, when you're genius, you need to have more choices, and it's harder to write for them. And there's no way I would throw a command line in front of someone who has never used a source control tool before. It's just too confusing. So the next technique, a classic magical technique, is the technique of direction. Sometimes when you're doing a trick, the effect is going to happen in some place where they don't expect it to happen, which is the point of the magic trick. So you need to get the audience attention control to where the magic trick is going to be. Now, there's only 2 techniques I'm going to talk about today, because there's things like fonts and colors and all sorts of other things. But I'm going to talk about motion and faces. Our brains still work on instinct. I mean, for a long time, we were used to looking for things moving on the edge, because they might be threats, they might be dangers. A rock falling from a mountain on us could kill us if we don't move fast enough. Similarly, faces, when you're out in the world and you run into a human being, the first thing you need to do is you need to identify, is this a friend or is this a foe? And the way that you do that is you look at their faces. The faces are the most unique things about humans. So these things, they're needed, they're really important things that have been in our minds and instincts. And they're so hardwired that they are the first things that we go to. So here's an example for motion. This is the, is it going to start playing? This is from Stack Overflow, a website that we all use. And the categories that they have here for their help topics are not in the same order, the same placement of the icons in the menu. Because the icons make sense in one sense, and the ordering of the help makes sense in another sense. So what they do is when you click on the heading to get information about it, they bounce up the icons that are possibly far away from the help. And they're relying on your peripheral vision to associate that particular help topic with that particular icon. It's probably the best use of motion I've seen in an application in my life. It's really subtle, it's really effective. Now, the second one, and you're going to want to watch this, put your eyes right in the middle and don't look on either faces, and I promise you, all of these faces have not been touched. They have not been altered in the slightest bit. But what's going on is your brain does not have enough time to process all of the details of the faces. It only has time to get the highest priority information. So by the time it has to clear its cache, it's only going to remember the most important parts, and it usually exaggerates them. So these faces are going to look very grotesque and very exaggerated the longer that you stare in the middle. And they're actually pretty people. They're actually visually attractive people in this example. But when you're trying to compare them that fastly, it just doesn't look right. And that's because our brains are absolutely focusing on processing the parts of the face. So when your eyes see a face in an application, they're immediately going to go for it, try and recognize it within the first 0.5 of a second. So here's an example of how you might use faces in an application. You're probably seeing it all over the place and don't realize it. Any of the designs that have had user icons that have generally been faces have always settled on putting the face to the top and to the leading edge of the text that you're reading. For us Western cultures, it's going to be in the top left. For some of the Middle Eastern and Eastern cultures, they're going to put the faces to the right of the status. because your face is going to, your attention is going to go there, and they wanted to put it someplace where you're going to start reading. So you're going to start reading from the top left and get the attention. And if you just quickly glance onto this page, you're not going to see all the text on there. You know, you're not going to see the jokes about Pearl Jam and airfare tickets. You're going to look at the faces. And that Penn and Teller magic trick on flag burning, it's not what you think it is. It's actually pretty effective. But you know, you got the face here, here, here. And even LinkedIn, when you don't put a user profile face in, they put an outline in its place because it's that important to the layout. It's that important to the way that you're working with the website. So if you use faces, be aware. Your attention is going to go straight to that face, the very first thing, assuming nothing's moving on your page. Then it's going to go there second. And if the face is moving, it's going to go there immediately. So the next topic I want to talk about, I used to do in 2 parts. But it's really, you have to do it in 1 part. Simulation and dissimulation. You put these things 2 together, and really it's a form of magical disguise. So what does it mean? Simulate, we all know what simulate means. It's, you know, to model, replicate, duplicate behavior, the appearance or properties of. You're trying to make it look like something that it isn't. Dissimulate is actually the same thing. To hide or disguise by adopting a false appearance. You're trying to make something look like something that it isn't. In this case, to hide its details. Simulate, you're creating stuff that isn't there, and dissimulate, you're hiding it. So really, you could think of this as the double rainbow of magical disguise. Things almost always go together. So let's look at this thing. This is a cute little log mill out east of London. You know, we got the water wheel that spins. There's actual water in there. We got a little plow. We got a cute little lake. And does anyone know what this thing actually is? Garage? Close. It's not a garage. It's not a mill. It's an electrical substation. And who wants to stare at that ugly thing in the middle of your subdivision? No, you'd rather look at a mill and say, oh, isn't that quaint? So they're dissimulating the real functionality by simulating something else. They're dissimulating the big ugly green box that's going to be in the middle of the lake by putting a nice rustic looking mill in the middle of it. Simulation and dissimulation almost always go together. It's hard to simulate something without dissimulating something else. It's hard to dissimulate something else without simulating something else. Here's another example from Google. They're trying to dissimulate. It's their presentation application, and they're trying to dissimulate that you're using a web page by trying to make it look like an application. And this is actually on the page talking about, from a talk I gave previously, and I swore I picked this before the keynote. I was talking about the date component there. And it doesn't quite work, though, because there's too many things that really betray its true nature, even when you maximize it and go full screen in Mac application. You still got, on the top here, you still got this ugly search bar that they're putting up there. When you simulate and dissimulate something, it's not enough to get close. You have to get it completely, or people are going to obsess and focus on the things that are wrong. And when they expect things to be there, they're going to focus on their absence. Which brings us to a topic that is currently the big deal on a lot of the design blogs, the issue of skeuomorphism. Now, a skeuomorph, it came from an archaeological thing where they used to find pottery that was made by a technique that was different from the old technique. They used to use metal rivets or some metal marks on the pottery, and they started making it by hand. Well, with their fingers, they would still put the metal marks in as though it was created by metal. They don't use that technique anymore. And just like your jeans, the rivets on your jeans, 90% of that little rivet on there is useless. That little thing in the middle is what's holding the jeans together because they're made of steel. When they were made of brass, they needed the whole rivet. Why do they still put the rivet there? People expect it to be there. It reminds them. It makes them feel safe. And let's look at some of these icons. These icons are from Microsoft Office for Mac. When was the last time a Mac loaded a floppy disk? My printer doesn't look like that. I don't think I've ever used a clipboard to save my clippings on. Usually I'm handing it to something to somebody and saying sign here. And, you know, we don't really create a paper. But the only thing on here that's not really skeuomorphic is this icon. Does anyone know what that icon, the second from the left, does? New document from template. And that's kind of what the window looks like when you bring it up if you were to scale it down to 32 by 32 pixels. And they're probably going to be stuck with that for the next 15 versions of Office. They've created their own new skeuomorph. But Apple is big on these real-world simulations. Here's an example of iBook. And what's interesting about it is you got the little pages here. You got the little leaves on here on the edge of the pages. You have the little gutter in the middle and over here. And you still got your buttons up here and you got your page indicators down there. But what's important is when you hand this to somebody who has never seen a book reading application before, they look at this and they say, oh, this is a book. And it has pages, so I should expect there's more pages. And how do I turn the page? They're going to put their finger on the page and they're going to try and start moving it. So the skeuomorphism, I think skeuomorphism is great when it helps aid the understanding of the application. When you're simulating real-world things that actually help you understand what's going on with the application, you should do it. And we're probably going to be reading books like this forever. Back when we're not printing them on dead paper anymore, it's going to look like a dead paper book. And this is the wrong example of skeuomorphism. When I don't know if you can see this at a distance, but these buttons are stitched leather. When I see something that's stitched leather, I don't think it can move. And I think that they're playing a trick on me saying, we'll let you think you can unsubscribe from this emailing list, but no, you're subscribed. And who stitches leather onto wood paneling? It's, And this comes from a website named SKEUOMORPH. They've got all sorts of these. SKEU.IT. But this is one that they bagged on that I actually think is actually a fairly good indication of what skeuomorphism is about. They were making fun, I don't know if you can tell this at a distance, but there's these little ridges on the button. And these little ridges, what they tell me, put your finger on it and move it to the side. If I had a smooth button, I wouldn't know. Would I tap it? Would I nudge it from the side? Would I shake it? But those little ridges, I remember seeing stuff like that as a kid. You touch it and you move it to the side. And when they have the on and the off words, it tells you another thing. This is a toggle. So it's these subtle little contextual cues that they use in skeuomorphism to tell you how to use it. You don't have to read a 50-page manual to figure out how to use this control, although some people are going to have to write this manual up anyway. So more than graphics, you're going to want to dissimulate and simulate your interactions. And this is another picture that I swore I picked before the keynote. This is Reader Rabbit, and in this case they're teaching kids how to use coin money, which may become a skeuomorph in its own right if Mint Chip gets its way. But what they're really doing with the kids there, with these cute animated animals, with these stories, with these compelling interactions, they're actually teaching these kids. They're tricking the kids into educating themselves. So the behaviors that they're doing are being dissimulated and simulated into various ways. And they got to simulate the look of the money on there. So when a kid sees a coin in the real world, they'll accept it and understand it. And when they write this application for Canada and France and everywhere else, they got to change the coins. But the interactions are something that is important to dissimulate. This is about user experience. It's not about user interface. So here's one example of something that we're probably dissimulating our interactions with it. This is a popular website, Stack Overflow. You have a problem, you post a question, people answer it. The popular answers get upvoted, so ideally the best answer is at the top. Now you might think that the point of this application is to create a knowledge base of answers to questions that are commonly found. And in the early days, that's what it started out as. But really it's become a recruiting database to find out who answers which questions the quickest and who gets the questions right most often. It's something that they are starting to leverage to make money. They're selling access to this information to the recruiters. So they're simulating your interaction. You're demonstrating your technical expertise and knowledge on this website without actually having to go through an interview or prove it by revealing proprietary information. Facebook is probably one of the leaders in this form of dissimulation of selling your data. I'm probably being a little too hard on Stack Overflow. On Facebook, I don't know that I'm being that hard on. So I've touched on this briefly. Oh, I'm supposed to do a trick here. And you know what? I'm going to use a different deck of cards here this time. I swear. See, it's even the Java 1 2009 cards. So here, I'll make it easy. So what I'm going to do is the routine. I'm going to ask a question, and you're going to answer it. And I was actually so confident that I wrote the answer right here on this little notepad. So go ahead and pick. I'll make this easy on you. Go ahead and pick a card. Any card. Okay. Show it to the audience. Is that card the 3 of clubs? No, it is not. It looks like no to me. Context, you got to get it right. Yeah, the question I asked, is that the three of clubs? And the answer is no. When I give you that card and I say pick a card, any card, if this is a club, sorry, six of diamonds actually. When you see a card trick, you're thinking, oh, he's going to guess what the card is. But I told you I'm going to ask a question. And I ask a question, is that the three of clubs? No. And the reason I knew that the answer was no is that I took the three of clubs and I shoved it here in my little badge reel. Again, another cruel little trick. But you think in that context that I'm going to do one thing and actually do another. So that's the importance of context. These little conscious and subconscious cues that we're given to people provide the context of how you answer of how you interact with it. A little bit of context is worth pages of manuals to tell them what they're doing. If they don't have a document like in Word, when you don't have a document that you're editing, you have nothing open, there's nothing on there. When it's blank, it's there. Those little contextual cues. So here's another example of context. It's a little one of those spot the differences thing. Can you spot the 8 differences? Now the context you're thinking is that there's going to be 8 different things, but what you're not expecting is the 8 different things are leg number 1, leg number 2, leg number 3. So the context, and when you realize the joke, you start giggling. It's like, oh, I was so foolish to see this. I loved this the first time I saw this. It took me over to realize that the joke was on me, that it was just the 8 legs that were missing. So the context is essential. So let's say I wanted to rate an application, I wanted to rate something as 3 stars. How good is that? I don't know. 3 stars? Is this 3 stars out of 4? 3 out of 4 is a pretty good whatever, that's 75%. 3 out of 5? Not as impressive. And what we're doing here to communicate the context is we have empty stars and we have full stars. So we're communicating the context in this that there is a 5-star scale and then it's received 3 of those 5 stars. Just that little bit of context of filling the star in and not having the star there tells the end user whether this is a good or a bad example. But in this case, if I'm talking about a 3-star restaurant, that I have, a reservation at a 3-star restaurant tonight, most people who know about restaurant ratings are going to, their jaw's going to drop and say, how did you get that? Because in restaurants are rated on a 3-star scale. There's no stars, which means it's a restaurant. There's 1 star. Yeah, the health department hasn't shut it down is really what it means. 1 star means it's a good restaurant, that you actually want to eat there. 2 stars means it's a really good restaurant. You really want to eat there. And this is from Michelin, the same tire company that created this star rating system. They had in their little traveler's book, if a restaurant was worth eating at, they'd put it in the book. If it was a good one, they'd give it 1 star. If it was really good, they'd give it 2 stars. And if you should drive out of your way to eat at that restaurant, they gave it 3 stars. So context, it goes 2 different ways. 3 stars sounds like a silly thing to rate something, but in the proper context of restaurants, a 3-star rating is awesome. Really, it's a 10-star scale, and they start counting stars at 8. So the context operates usually subconsciously. When you're looking at this slide, you're probably expecting more, because this one isn't centered properly. There's a lot of space there. If there wasn't more, I'd either top do it or do it on the center, which goes to an important thing. Context operates in both directions. Your application can communicate things to your user via various contexts. And similarly, you can learn things from your users in context. So this is Java 1. I have to do some code. I don't think it's in the contract. They don't make us sign a contract, but I would be remiss if I didn't put some code in here. And this is an example of some swing builder code. This is a Groovy framework that I wrote that does layouts. It does the visual part of putting a GUI together. So here we have a panel, and contained in it are all these labels. And so first let me mention, developers are users too. When you're creating a user experience, you've got to realize that your developers are going to be doing this experience too. The developers. And another magical thing is you put your code examples near the end of the talk, you can compress them if you need to. You've got about 6 minutes. But what I want to first start talking about is this little line on the bottom, and it's kind of hard to see, so I'll go ahead and move it up top. But right here, get the laser button. Right here, up here, this is the calculating the hypotenuse of a triangle. We're squaring it, and we're getting the square root. And what I'm doing in this application is I'm drawing a triangle and calculating the size for them. So when I put this in context of a node in my swing builder in Groovy, When I have a labeled parameter text and I say bind, I'm giving it context. I'm saying I want this function as a closure, the braces say it's a closure, to be bound. What am I binding it to? That's the advantage of the named parameter text. In the runtime, I can take this context from the user that they have named the parameter text. And in context, the label happens to have a text attribute. So it's going to bind the value to that text attribute. When that equation changes, we're going to change the text on that. And it's really terse because we're using as much context as we can get from the end user to determine what properties to change. So let's move it back down. Similarly, what properties to put on some of these nodes is given by the context. I happen to be in a panel that has been set with a grid bag layout. Grid X, grid Y, and anchor are not actually properties on the label, on the J label. But when I put it in context with that grid bag container, I can figure out, hey, maybe I should take these properties and actually apply it to the layout. And finally, there is this random variable model that in these scripts, when you see the full script, is never declared. How do we know what model is? The context there is from where it lives in the file tree. Things way outside where you might think might be important are actually relevant. And we follow the conventions that are common in Rails and Grails of matching up the name of the view, the model of the controller. And what the framework does is it automatically injects an instance of that model into the script at runtime, all based on the context of where it lives in the file tree. And this is something that the developer has told the runtime, given it all the information it needs in context. Context is a wonderful thing. Context is a magical thing. With all the context in the world, you can figure out a lot of things. Try and keep as much context and use as much of it as possible because you can make an efficient and magical interface with these magic. So in review, here are the 6 items that I've really talked about. There's the ethics that you really need to consider when you're doing a magic trick. And you need to consider your audience. You need to leverage your stage. Your stage is very important. It's an essential part of the magic trick. And when you give your users a choice, usually you're giving them the illusion of choice. You're limiting their choices, but you don't want them to know that they're limited. And simulation and dissimulation are magical disguise. And context is a very powerful magical technique. But one more thing. Now you put these things together, and you have a context of, hey, look, I'm going to make a cane appear out of thin air. If I do it right. Again, I screwed the trick up. So let's go back to Maslow's hierarchy. In the first 4 layers, you got to practice it. That's why I'm not a magician. But there's one more thing that you need to remember. Is that when you're a developer creating a user experience, there are 2 worlds. There is the world of the magician, and there is the world of the user. The world of the magician is what you are playing as a developer, creating this that someone else is going to use, whether they're another developer or whether they're an end user. It is reality. And the users are in the same reality. They just have a different perspective on it. They're relying on you as a developer to create a better reality for them, to help them understand what is going on, to help them use the application. Because most magic tricks, when done properly, you forget about them. But when they mess them up, like my magic cane trick, they don't focus, it doesn't fall through. And that's the paradox of a good user interface developer. When you do your job right, nobody notices. It's kind of an unforgiving line of work. But that's just the thrill of seeing a user use it and not realize that they're being shepherded and herded in the correct way to use their application efficiently. It's got to be one of the most satisfying things out there, to be able to do your tricks right. So I'd like to thank you for coming to the next to last talk on a conference. To have a room this full, it's really a great feeling. We got 2 minutes, a minute for questions if anyone has any. Yes?
The slide where you had the on-off switches and you were saying the website still gives it a hard time. What did you give it a hard time about?
Having the ridges, which I thought was the right thing to do. Yes?
So how do you balance between open sourcing and keeping it a secret?
How do you balance between open sourcing and keeping it secret? The first thing is if you're using someone else's open source code, you need to respect the license they've given to it. And really, it's how much do you want to give back to the community? If it's something that's a general purpose, at my company, if it's specific to the line of work, we don't open source it. We don't open source a lot of stuff. It's government, but What I've seen generally is if it's specific to the line of work and unique, you don't open source it. If it's framework, if it's glue work, share the glue. Don't share the pieces you're gluing together. That's kind of what I've seen.